In this new world of fractured states, there was one group that rose above the rest, a formidable force with ambitions to reshape the continent. Their leader, a charismatic warrior monk named Clovis, united disparate groups under his banner, not through brute force, but by forging strategic alliances and embracing Christianity. But their rise didn't come without challenges. Rival Germanic tribes and the remnants of Roman authority tested their mettle. Yet the Frankish king and his successors stood firm, establishing a dominion that stretched from the North Sea to the Byzantine Empire. But even as they reached the zenith of their power, internal strife threatened to tear them down. A succession crisis nearly shattered the Frankish realm, plunging it into a maelstrom of civil war and foreign interventions. However, from the ashes of this turmoil, a new Frankish identity emerged, leading the way into the early medieval period. Join us as we explore the origins, conquests, and eventual fracturing of the Merovingian dynasty, a tale of ambition, betrayal, and the birth of a new Europe. The decline of the Western Roman Empire left a power vacuum across Western Europe, which was quickly filled by various Germanic tribes. Among them were the Franks, a people of Ripuarian, Salian, and Lombardy origin who inhabited the Low Countries, roughly modern-day Netherlands and northern France, and parts of Western Germany. They were divided into three principal groups, each with their own chieftains. These groups, known as the Ripuarians, Salian, and Lombards, were situated along the Rhine and Meuse rivers in what is now the Low Countries in northern France. Each had their own chieftain, and together they formed a loose confederation. During this time, the Franks were a collection of small, independent tribes without any centralized authority or grand ambitions of empire. They were primarily occupied with local rivalries and defending their territory against other Germanic peoples, as well as the remnants of Roman authority. It was an age when might made right and survival depended on the strength of one sword. Yet amidst this chaos, a young Frankish chieftain named Clovis set his sights on more than just local dominance. He dreamt of uniting the fractured Frankish tribes and creating a powerful kingdom that could stand toe-to-toe with the old Roman rulers. Clovis's ambitions were nothing short of transforming the political landscape of Western Europe. His vision was a unified Frankish kingdom that would stretch from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, encompassing territories ruled by his Frankish peers. Under his banner, Clovis assembled a formidable army, laying the foundation for a new power structure in Western Europe. Through a combination of military prowess and shrewd diplomacy, he set about forging a united Frankish kingdom. His first order of business was to subdue his Frankish rivals, incorporating their territories into his growing domain. One by one, he defeated the other chieftains, bringing the once disparate tribes under his rule. Yet Clovis's ambitions didn't end at the borders of his Frankish peers. He set his sights on the Gallo-Roman provinces, the very heartland of the former Roman Empire. There he encountered stiff resistance from the remnants of Roman authority, including the Visigoths, a powerful Germanic tribe that had established their own kingdom in southern Gaul. Despite these challenges, Clovis pressed on, driven by his desire to create a kingdom that would rival the glory of Rome itself. As Clovis expanded his kingdom, he also embraced a critical tool of Roman governance, administration. He appointed loyal members of the Roman elite to key positions, ensuring the efficient management of his growing realm. It was a pragmatic move that allowed him to govern over a diverse population spread across a vast territory. But perhaps Clovis's most significant decision was his conversion to Christianity. In 496, he and his followers were baptized, marking a pivotal moment in European history. This wasn't merely a personal spiritual journey, but a strategic decision that endeared him to the Gallo-Roman populace and provided a unifying religious identity to his diverse kingdom. Under Clovis's leadership, the Franks transitioned from being a collection of minor Germanic tribes to becoming a major player on the European stage. Clovis's successors continued this trajectory, expanding the Frankish kingdom even further and solidifying its position as the dominant power in Western Europe. However, this period of growth and stability was not without its internal tensions. The Merovingian dynasty's grip on power was challenged from within, threatening to unravel the very fabric of the Frankish state. After Clovis's death in 511, his vast kingdom was divided among his sons, setting the stage for a new era of conflict and competition within the Frankish royal family. This fragmentation led to a decline in the kingdom's unity and power, giving rise to internal conflicts and external threats. Rivalries among the brothers and their successors resulted in constant warfare, weakening the Frankish state and hindering its ability to respond effectively to threats both near and far. Despite these challenges, the Merovingian dynasty persevered, demonstrating remarkable resilience in the face of adversity. Their ability to adapt and overcome internal divisions was crucial in maintaining the continuity of the Frankish state. Over the next century, the Merovingians successfully defended their territory against various invaders, including the Lombards and the second wave of the Muslim conquests. However, as the 6th century gave way to the 7th, the Frankish kingdom found itself on the brink of collapse. By the mid-7th century, the authority of the Merovingian kings had been significantly weakened by internal strife, and the kingdom's resources were stretched thin due to constant warfare. The result was a Frankish realm on the verge of disintegration, unable to effectively defend itself against external threats. Yet amidst this seeming decline, a new power was rising within the Frankish kingdom, a force that would eventually lead the Franks to new heights of power and prestige. Enter Charles Martel, a member of the Carolingian dynasty and the mayor of the palace, effectively making him the most powerful man in the Frankish kingdom. Charles Martel's rise to power marked a turning point in Frankish history. As the kingdom teetered on the brink of collapse, he emerged as a beacon of stability and strength. His lineage, the Carolingians, initially held a relatively minor position within the Frankish court as administrators of the royal household. However, Charles Martel's ambitions and abilities propelled him to the forefront of power. His efforts to stabilize the kingdom and protect it from external threats earned him the respect and admiration of the Frankish nobility. Central to Charles Martel's rise was his successful defense of the kingdom against the expanding forces of Islam. In 732, he achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Tours, which halted the Muslim advance into Western Europe and secured the future of the Frankish kingdom. This victory not only solidified his power base, but also elevated him to a legendary status in European history. As Charles Martel consolidated his power, he gradually marginalized the weakened Merovingian kings, effectively creating a new power structure within the Frankish kingdom. This shift in power dynamics set the stage for the eventual demise of the Merovingian dynasty and the rise of the Carolingians, which will be covered in detail in our upcoming episode. By the middle of the 8th century, the political landscape of the Frankish kingdom had undergone a dramatic transformation. The once dominant Merovingian dynasty had been pushed to the periphery, their power and prestige significantly diminished. In their place, a new power structure had emerged, with members of the Carolingian dynasty, notably Charles Martel and his son Pepin the Short, firmly in control. The shift in power was not simply a change in families, but represented a fundamental alteration in the way the Frankish kingdom was governed. Charles Martel's victories in battle, particularly the Battle of Tours, had cemented his authority and that of his family within the kingdom. This military success had not only demonstrated their strength, but had also enhanced their prestige and legitimacy in the eyes of the Frankish nobility. Moreover, the association of the Carolingians with the papacy added a layer of religious legitimacy to their rule. Pope Stephen II crowned Pepin the Short in 751, a symbolic gesture that linked the dynasty's fortunes to the authority of the church. This union proved advantageous, as it provided the Carolingians with a strong ally in their struggle for power and legitimacy. However, despite the apparent consolidation of power, cracks were beginning to show in the new Frankish order. The deposition of the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, and the transfer of the kingdom to Pepin the Short had not gone smoothly. There were those within the Frankish nobility who opposed this change and saw the rise of the Carolingians as a usurpation of power. These dissidents, combined with the simmering discontent among the remnants of the Merovingian court, created a volatile atmosphere of mistrust and resentment. Furthermore, the expansion of the Carolingian dynasty as power beyond the realm of the mayor of the palace was seen as a threat by some members of the Frankish elite who feared the erosion of their own influence and authority. This growing tension and rivalry set the stage for a period of instability and conflict within the Frankish kingdom, a prelude to the turbulent events that would ultimately lead to its fracturing. As the seeds of discord were sown, the Frankish kingdom found itself at a critical juncture in its history. The question of who would succeed Pepin the Short loomed large, threatening to unravel the very fabric of the newly established Carolingian dynasty. Pepin's sons, ostensibly his heirs, were seen as weak and incapable of governing, casting an ominous shadow over the kingdom's future. Amidst this uncertainty, a new contender emerged, a charismatic and ambitious member of the Frankish nobility named Drogo, Duke of Burgundy. His claim to the throne, rooted in his lineage and marriage to a daughter of the deposed Merovingian king, resonated with many within the kingdom, particularly those who yearned for the restoration of the Merovingian dynasty. The brewing conflict reached a boiling point when Drogo rebelled against Pepin the Short's authority, igniting a full-scale civil war within the Frankish kingdom. The realm was thrown into chaos as rival factions took sides, each vying for a piece of the action. Some supported the incumbent Carolingian dynasty, while others rallied behind Drogo and his claims to the throne. This internal strife not only weakened the Frankish state, but also provided an opportunity for external forces to test their mettle. The Saxons, a powerful Germanic people inhabiting the region north of the Franks, took advantage of the civil war and launched a full-scale invasion into Frankish territory. Led by their chief, Wittikin, the Saxons advanced deep into Frankish lands, causing widespread devastation and threatening the very existence of the kingdom. The Frankish nobles, already divided by the succession crisis, now had to unite to repel the Saxon onslaught. And so they did, forming a coalition of sorts to drive back the invaders. But even in the face of this common enemy, old wounds and rivalries refused to heal. The collaboration between the two factions was tenuous at best, and the threat of renewed civil war loomed over the kingdom like a dark cloud. It was a precarious situation, a classic tale of enemies becoming allies, all thanks to the common threat of an even greater danger. But the question remained, would this alliance hold? Would the Franks be able to repel the Saxon invasion, and if so, at what cost? That concludes our episode on the rise of the Franks and the beginning of the end for the Merovingian dynasty. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the channel, please consider supporting us. It is the year 800 CE, and the Western Roman Empire has been dead for over 2 centuries. Europe is a patchwork of small kingdoms, duchies and counties ruled over by kings and queens who are more concerned with maintaining order in their domains than expanding them. That is until now. Out of this tumultuous period, one figure rose to dominate the continent: Charlemagne, King of the Franks. A brilliant military strategist and a cunning politician, he united a vast territory through conquest and diplomacy. He crushed his enemies, including the Saxons and the Lombards, and expanded his kingdom to include much of modern-day France, Germany, and Italy. And on Christmas Day, 800 CE, Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III. This act was not just a symbolic gesture. It created a powerful new political and spiritual entity, merging the authority of a king with the divine mandate of the Church. This would define European politics for centuries to come. So welcome to the series and to our first episode, The Rise of Charlemagne. When Charlemagne died in 814 CE, his empire was the largest in Europe since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It stretched from the North Sea to the Adriatic, encompassing most of modern-day France, Germany and Italy, and parts of Spain, Belgium, Switzerland, and Austria. But when he inherited the Frankish throne in 768, it looked very different. Back then, the Frankish kingdom was centered in what is today northern France and the Low Countries, and consisted of three parts: Neustria in the north, Austrasia in the east, and Burgundy in the south. These regions were ruled over by three separate kings and were often at war with each other. Not exactly a power that could dominate Europe. So how did Charlemagne turn a small regional kingdom into an empire? Let's start with the man himself. Born in 742, Charlemagne was the grandson of Clovis, the first king of the Franks to unite the various Frankish tribes under one banner and convert them to Christianity. After Clovis's death, the Frankish kingdom was divided among his sons and grandsons. And when Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Short, died in 768, he and his brother Carloman jointly inherited the throne. Within a year, however, Carloman had died, leaving Charlemagne sole ruler of the Franks. Although he inherited a kingdom far smaller than his grandfather's, Charlemagne was determined to restore Frankish greatness. He began by conquering the remaining Frankish territories and establishing control over the entire region between the North Sea and the Mediterranean. But he didn't stop there. He went on to conquer neighboring kingdoms too. One of his first major campaigns was against the Lombards, an Italian kingdom located south of the Alps. In 774, he invaded northern Italy and defeated the Lombard king Desiderius. Then he seized the city of Milan and forced Desiderius to cede large parts of northern Italy to the Franks. This campaign was personally important to Charlemagne as well as politically and strategically significant. You see, his father had been granted the title of King of Italy by Pope Stephen III in 756 after he helped defend Rome against the Lombards. By conquering northern Italy, Charlemagne was fulfilling his father's dream of creating a Frankish kingdom in Italy. It also gave him control over the wealthy Lombard cities such as Milan, which became the capital of his Italian kingdom. Plus, it secured his western flank by eliminating the Lombard threat. Another group that had threatened the Franks were the Saxons, a Germanic people who lived north of the Frankish kingdom in what is today northern Germany. The Saxons had long been a thorn in the side of the Franks, raiding their territory and resisting their attempts at expansion. So in 772, Charlemagne launched a massive campaign against them. Over the next 5 years, he fought many battles against the Saxons, but they proved to be a tough nut to crack. They were aided by their geographic location. See, the Saxons lived in a dense forest that covered much of northern Germany. This made it difficult for the Franks to attack them since they could easily hide in the woods and launch surprise attacks. Despite these setbacks, Charlemagne pressed on and eventually defeated the Saxons. In 785, he forced them to convert to Christianity and accept Frankish rule. This was a major victory for Charlemagne as it opened up northern Germany to Frankish influence and eliminated a major enemy. Now, before we go further, a quick word from our sponsor. Now back to the video. Having crushed the Lombards and the Saxons, Charlemagne turned his attention to the north. In 793, he led his army across the North Sea to the island of Lindisfarne in England, where he raided and sacked a monastery. This was the beginning of the Viking Age, a period of time when Scandinavian raiders known as Vikings conducted widespread raids on monasteries and coastal towns throughout Europe. Charlemagne's invasion of Lindisfarne was one of the earliest Viking raids. In response, he began to fortify the coasts of his kingdom to protect them from Viking attacks. He also encouraged monks to build fortified monasteries, which became known as safety zones or places of refuge where people could hide from Viking raids. This strategy worked for a while, but in the late 8th century, the Vikings began to push further inland, targeting monasteries in the interior of the Frankish kingdom. Charlemagne responded by launching a series of punitive expeditions against the Vikings, during which he inflicted heavy casualties on them. Despite these victories, he was unable to stop the Viking raids completely. And in 801, a Viking army led by a man named Ragnar Lothbrok sacked the Frankish city of Tours, killing and imprisoning many people. This defeat humiliated Charlemagne, and he was determined to get revenge. He assembled a massive army and marched into northern Germany to punish the Vikings. There he fought many battles against them and inflicted heavy casualties. But once again, he was unable to stop the Viking raids completely. By this point, Charlemagne realized that he needed more than brute force to deal with the Vikings. He needed to find a way to integrate them into his kingdom. So he began to offer them a choice: either convert to Christianity and accept Frankish rule, or leave his kingdom and raid elsewhere. Some Vikings chose to accept his offer, while others continued to resist. But overall, it was a successful strategy, and gradually the Viking raids in the Frankish kingdom declined. With the Viking threat somewhat contained, Charlemagne was able to turn his attention back to Italy. In 799, the Byzantine emperor asked him for help in recovering the city of Rome, which had recently been seized by the Lombards. Charlemagne obliged, and in 806 led an army into Italy to assist the Byzantines. However, the campaign was unsuccessful, and he was forced to make peace with the Lombards. This may have been a setback for Charlemagne, but it did have one positive outcome. During this campaign, he forged a close relationship with the Pope, which would pay off in a big way in the near future. In 800, while Charlemagne was on a campaign in northern Italy, the Pope traveled to meet him and ask for his support in defending the church against the Lombards. Charlemagne obliged and crushed a Lombard army that was threatening Rome. As a reward, the Pope crowned Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day. This was a highly significant event, not just for Charlemagne, but for Europe as a whole. The title of Holy Roman Emperor was a revival of the Western Roman Empire. It symbolized the union of the secular power of a king with the spiritual authority of the church. It also created a new political entity in Europe, one that was both religious and political in nature. This would become the defining feature of European politics for centuries to come. Unfortunately, we don't know much about the coronation ceremony itself, but we do know that it took place in the Church of St. Peter in Rome. We also know that Charlemagne and his son Louis were present, as well as many other members of the Frankish nobility. The ceremony was likely similar to other imperial coronations of the time, involving a lot of pageantry and symbolism. But the significance of the event cannot be overstated. For the first time in over 2 centuries, someone had been crowned Emperor of the Romans. It was a clear statement of the Pope's authority and a reminder of the close relationship between the Church and the Frankish kingdom. The rise of Charlemagne marked a turning point in European history. His vast empire and the revival of the Holy Roman Empire brought a new sense of unity to the continent. He had expanded the Frankish kingdom to cover more territory than any previous king and had established a close relationship with the Pope. Moreover, his empire was religiously diverse, ruling over Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike. He was also a patron of learning and culture, and his court at Aachen became a center of intellectual activity. Unfortunately, He would not live to see the full extent of his empire. He died in January 814 after a long and successful reign. His empire was divided among his sons, but it would not last long. Internal conflicts and external pressures would soon tear it apart. Still, the legacy of Charlemagne lived on in the Holy Roman Empire, which would survive in one form or another for another 1,000 years. The year is 768. You are watching this report. Charlemagne has just died. His empire is stable, prosperous, and at peace. In fact, it's never been a better time to live in Western Europe. The Franks have pushed back the Lombards. The Saxons are about to be converted, and the king's nephew succeeds him as the emperor of the West. Life is good. And then from the cold, dark north, a new enemy emerges to challenge the Frankish dominance over Western Europe. They come from the coasts of Scandinavia, riding on long ships with bulging dragon heads, wielding axes the size of small men, and wearing helmets with horns. They're the Vikings. And yes, that's what they were. The Vikings attacked from the sea, pillaging along the coasts. Monasteries and small towns were easy targets for these ferocious raiders. A single Viking warband could sail up a river, raid a city, turn around and sail back down the same river all in a day. Most of the time, they were looking for gold, silver, or anything else that they could sell in the slave markets. But sometimes they just wanted land. They had nowhere near the population of the Frankish Empire, so they gladly accepted any territory they could conquer. In 862, a Viking named Ragnar Lothbrok led his fleet to the coast of modern-day France and sacked the city of Paris. Even though King Eudes had paid the Vikings a hefty sum to spare his city, they attacked anyway and only left when Eudes agreed to convert the town to Christianity and pay an even bigger ransom. So not only did Paris have to pay up, but now they also had to convert. 3 years later, the Vikings went even further south and attacked the English city of London. This time it was King Alfred the Great who managed to hold them off. He wasn't able to beat them, but he did manage to force them to lift their siege after 5th attempt. Alfred would go on to win his battles against the Vikings, pushing them back and reclaiming England's lost territories. But for a while, his victory was in doubt because his forces weren't very prepared. When the Vikings first showed up, most Englishmen were busy minding their own business and didn't realize that they were under attack. The Anglo-Saxons, as we've seen before, weren't exactly known for being military geniuses. And this time they found themselves in a bit of trouble. As soon as the Vikings got off their ships, they started to plunder the countryside. And before long, they had taken control of the southwest coast. By the time Alfred realized what was happening and put together a fighting force, they had taken 2 of his best friends, captured his wife and son, and burned down his house. Alfred would eventually defeat the Vikings and take back his kingdom. But in order to do so, he needed to prepare. He set out to reform his army, build more defensive structures, and generally get ready for another attack. In this way, the Vikings forced England to become stronger, which in turn would help them survive the next few centuries of attacks. While they were no match for Alfred the Great, many other European rulers didn't fare so well against the Vikings. Like Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's successor, Louis inherited his uncle's massive empire, but failed to maintain its borders. One of the areas that suffered from his lack of attention was the Danelaw, a region that stretched across northern England and parts of Scotland. It was here where the Vikings landed and set up shop in the 870s. Unable to stop them from coming ashore, Louis was forced to come to an agreement with them. Instead of fighting and possibly losing territory, he made a deal. The Vikings were allowed to keep what they had already conquered and were granted additional land if they stopped attacking. Soon, the Danes had taken such a large portion of England that they became their own official kingdom within the empire. Louis might have been able to contain the Vikings in England, but he wasn't able to stop them from taking the rest of his empire. In 866, a Viking army crossed the Alps into Italy and defeated the Lombard king. Louis' attempts to help his ally were unsuccessful, and the Lombards were forced to pay the Vikings to leave. This wasn't a problem for Louis. He didn't like the Lombards anyway and saw their defeat as an opportunity to reclaim some old Frankish territory. But the Vikings didn't leave. They kept moving further and further south, conquering new lands and forcing everyone who couldn't stop them to pay up. Louis did manage to push them out of northern Africa, but they took pieces of France, Spain, and Italy with them. After Louis died, the Vikings didn't even bother waiting for his successor to take the throne. They just attacked anyway. In 881, they seized the important city of Marseille, basically cutting off southern France from the rest of Europe. This was bad news for everyone. Controlling the Mediterranean Sea would make it easier to raid along the coast and attack inland cities. For the next 15 years, the Vikings would terrorize the Mediterranean, sacking Constantinople twice and wreaking havoc across the Byzantine Empire. But the Vikings weren't just raiders. They also traded with the people they met along their journeys. If there was a place they didn't want to conquer or destroy, they usually set up a trading post instead. Throughout the 8th and 9th centuries, they established a network of trading centers across the North Sea, Baltic Sea, and even the shores of North America. Their goods were in high demand in many parts of Europe and the Muslim world, and the Vikings were happy to provide them with exotic animals, furs, timber, and slaves. In return, they received silver, gold, spices, wine, and anything else that they could use to improve their quality of life. But despite their prowess on the seas and their skills as traders, the Vikings are mostly remembered today for their brutality. And it's true that their reputation isn't completely undeserved. They were fierce fighters, and they knew how to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. The Vikings wore horned helmets, carried large axes, and rode into battle on horseback while screaming bloody murder. They raided monasteries, burned villages, and slaughtered anyone who couldn't pay their exorbitant ransoms. Their reputation as bloodthirsty barbarians preceded them, and the mere mention of the word Viking was enough to send shivers down the spines of even the bravest warriors. But unlike what Hollywood would have you believe, the Vikings didn't wear horned helmets. That's a myth that originated from a misinterpretation of a single passage in a sensationalist Roman novel. It reads, quote, "Their helmets were adorned with three-pointed horns." The problem is that this description of Viking battle gear is completely inaccurate. We know this because archaeologists have found plenty of Viking helmets, and none of them have horns. Some had decorative braids, sure, but nothing that looked like those found on the helmets of their enemies. That's not to say that the Vikings didn't wear helmets, though. After all, they were known to be vicious fighters, and every advantage in battle was a matter of life and death. The type of helmet they wore was influenced by the culture they were fighting. When battling the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings adopted their style of helmet, which was round in shape and designed to be worn with chainmail. When facing the heavily armored knights of the Catholic Church, however, they switched to the Spangenhelm, a lighter helmet made of metal plates. These helmets were much more comfortable to wear and allowed the Vikings to stay agile and maneuverable in battle. Unfortunately, these helmets were still a bit vulnerable, and as the centuries passed, the Vikings needed to find a better way to protect themselves. Enter the horned helmet. It wasn't a practical design by any means, but it did have some benefits. First, the horns were great for deflecting arrows. Second, they could be used to hook onto an opponent's shield, allowing the wearer to get a better grip on their weapon. Third, they intimidated the living hell out of everyone who saw them. If there was a surefire way to scare your enemies, it was with a horned helmet. No one was willing to go toe-to-toe with someone wearing those things. It's also worth noting that not all Viking helmets had horns, just like not all Spartans wore red. Only elite soldiers and leaders would wear the most expensive and intimidating equipment. Common foot soldiers probably still used their old bucket helmets throughout much of the 9th century. But no matter what they looked like, the Vikings' greatest strength wasn't their choice of weaponry or armor. It was their navy. Viking ships were made specifically for warfare. They were fast, surprisingly durable, and incredibly intimidating. Their sails were huge and allowed them to travel quickly across the open seas. Their shallow drafts allowed them to sail up rivers and dock right in the heart of enemy territory. And their dragon heads struck fear into the hearts of those who saw them approaching. To put it simply, the Vikings were masters of the seas. They explored new lands, raided coastal towns, and dominated the North Atlantic. They were a force to be reckoned with, and their influence on European history is immeasurable. Feudalism, what is that? Is that the first thing you thought of when you heard the word? No. What about medieval Europe? Feudalism. Yes, it's certainly that. But what was feudalism? And how did it affect everyday people living in medieval Europe? Well, after the fall of Rome, there was a whole lot of chaos, like barbarians at the gate and everyone arguing with everyone else. So, in order to restore some semblance of peace and order, a new social and political order emerged: feudalism. At its head was the king, who held all of the land in theory. Now, in practice, he didn't actually own that much. You see, in order to keep the peace, the king would grant some of that land to his nobles, who in turn owed military service to the king. This created a pyramid structure of power and land ownership. At the top of the pyramid was the king. Below him were the nobles who received their land grants, called fiefs, in return for military service. Under them were the vassals who got smaller fiefs in return for their service as well. They might be knights, but oftentimes they were just regular old peasants too. These formed the middle layer of the pyramid, sandwiched between the nobles and the peasants. At the bottom of the pyramid were the peasants, or serfs, who worked the land in exchange for protection. And then above all of this was the Catholic Church. Here's a mnemonic to help you remember the pyramid structure of feudalism. King Charles the Hammer was totally awesome, granting feasts to nobles who needed protection from Vikings. Knights and serfs were also totally awesome because they kept the peace and maintained law and order. Now, what we need to talk about next is manorialism. That's right, manorialism. Sounds like something you should probably learn about, doesn't it? Well, if you're not convinced, consider this. Manorialism helped bring stability to medieval Europe during a time of great social and political upheaval. It provided a framework for economic activity and a basis for social organization. It encouraged technological innovation, and it offered a way of life that, well, okay, let's be honest, wasn't all that bad if you weren't a serf. So let's start with the basics. Manorialism was an economic system that developed during the Middle Ages based on the relationship between a lord and his peasants. Lords granted land to peasants in exchange for their labor and a portion of their crops. It was sort of like a sharecropping arrangement, except, well, it was a lot more rigid and the peasants could just pick up and leave whenever they wanted. We'll get to that. The economic engine of manorialism was the manor, which was the lord's estate. It typically consisted of a large house, a courtyard, gardens, stables, outbuildings, and a village where the peasants lived. The manor was largely self-sufficient, producing everything that was needed to sustain itself, from food to building materials to fuel. Now, the peasants who lived on the manor were not allowed to just pick up and leave. They were legally bound to the land and were required to work on the manor for a certain number of days each week. This system was known as a three-field system. Each manor was divided into 3 fields, and each field was planted with a different crop each year. This ensured that one field could always be used for planting while another was being harvested, and a third was left fallow or unplanted so that the soil could rest. This maximized the amount of food that could be grown on the land and helped ensure that the peasants had enough to eat. But what about the serfs themselves? Were they at least free? Well, they were free in the sense that they were not enslaved, but they were legally and economically dependent on the land they lived on. They could not leave without permission, and they were required to pay rent in the form of a portion of their crops. They were also subject to the whims of their lord. For example, if the lord decided to build a new barn, the serfs would be required to stop their work in the fields and help build it. Despite these constraints, manorialism provided a degree of stability and security for the peasants. They knew how much rent they had to pay and what obligations they had to fulfill. And in return, they had the right to live on the land and farm it for their own benefit. It was not a perfect system, but it did provide a measure of predictability and order in a time of great uncertainty. It's also important to note that manorialism was not a static system. It evolved over time and varied from place to place. For example, in some areas, peasants were able to negotiate better terms with their lords. In others, lords experimented with new technologies to increase production on their manors. And these changes helped shape the social and economic landscape of medieval Europe. So, in summary, manorialism was an economic system based on the relationship between a lord and his peasants. It was characterized by a three-field system of farming and a degree of legal and economic dependence on the part of the peasants. While it had its shortcomings, manorialism did provide a degree of stability and security in a time of great upheaval, and it played a significant role in the development of medieval European society. Hey, welcome back. Time to test your knowledge. How did the Catholic Church become so powerful during the Middle Ages? How did the social and political upheaval of the time contribute to the rise of feudalism? How did manorialism function, and what were its strengths and weaknesses? As we have seen, the Middle Ages were a period of great change and upheaval in European history. The fall of Rome left a power vacuum that resulted in the emergence of new political and social structures such as feudalism. During this time, the Catholic Church became the single most powerful institution in Europe due to its ability to provide stability and order in a time of chaos. The Catholic Church was a unifying force that transcended the divisions of feudalism. Manorialism developed as a way to organize agricultural production and provide for the needs of the population. It provided a stable economic system that helped to maintain social order and promote technological innovation. However, it also had its weaknesses, particularly for the peasant class. So now it's time to take action. Remember, if you don't use it, you lose it. So how do you keep these facts fresh in your mind? One way is to review your notes and flashcards regularly. This will help you to retain the information you've learned. You can also teach someone else what you've learned. This is an effective way to solidify your understanding of a topic. Or you could write a summary of the main points in your journal. Writing can help you process and internalize information. But wait, there's more. If you want to dive deeper into this fascinating topic, check out the additional resources. You'll find even more information and insights there. Imagine Europe in the year 1096, a continent divided into warring kingdoms and duchies, seemingly incapable of uniting against any threat, much less launching one themselves. This would soon change, however, because by the late 11th century, the Church had become so powerful that it was able to unite all of Europe under its banner for a single purpose, a holy war. So join me as we look at how the Crusades changed Europe forever. We often think of medieval Europe as being synonymous with Christianity, but this wasn't always the case. When Rome fell in 476 AD, Europe was home to numerous different religions, including various forms of Christianity, paganism, and even some forms of Judaism. But over the next few centuries, Christianity gradually became the dominant religion across the continent. By the 11th century, It was the state religion of France, England, Germany, and the Holy Roman Empire. While most of Eastern Europe was dominated by the Byzantine Empire, which also considered itself Christian. Despite this, there was still significant tension between the various Christian states and the papacy, which sought to establish itself as supreme over all secular authority. In 1054, things came to a head when Pope Leo IX and the Patriarch of Constantinople mutually excommunicated each other, leading to the official split between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. And it wasn't just churches that were fighting either. There was also constant warfare between the various Christian kingdoms of Europe. In fact, during the 11th century alone, the English king fought 2 separate civil wars, while the French and Germans went to war over control of the Holy Roman Empire. All this fighting made life very difficult for the Church, which desperately wanted to focus everyone's attention on something else, something big, something great. And this opportunity arose unexpectedly in 1095 when Pope Urban II addressed the Council of Clermont. Among many other topics, he discussed the plight of the Byzantine Empire, who had been under constant attack from the Seljuk Turks, a nomadic people from Central Asia who had recently converted to Islam. The Byzantines asked the Pope for help, but he didn't have an army to send. Instead, he had something even better: the European nobility. See, unlike his predecessors, Urban had a much more aggressive view of the papacy's role in Europe. He believed that the Pope should be involved in every aspect of Christian life, not just spiritual matters, but political ones too. In fact, he was already in the middle of a massive project to reform the Church and make it more efficient. In 1075, he introduced the Gregorian reforms, a set of measures designed to address the corruption and inefficiency of the clergy. These reforms included the establishment of the Gregorian Sacramentary, a standardized manual for church services, as well as the Dictatus Papae, a papal bull that outlined the authority of the Pope over both secular and religious rulers. The Dictatus Papae contained 13 different articles that listed the many ways in which the Pope was superior to kings and emperors. For example, he could depose them from their positions if they disobeyed him, or absolve them from their subjects if they refused to pay taxes. It also declared that priests couldn't marry and that monks shouldn't own property. These reforms weren't exactly popular among the nobility, who had grown accustomed to the lax attitude of previous popes, but Urban was determined to push forward. In 1080, he excommunicated the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV after he refused to submit to papal authority. Henry would later recant and submit to the Pope, but this event showed just how far the papacy's power had grown. And Urban was eager to use this power to accomplish something great. That's why when the Byzantines requested military aid, he decided to take a different approach than his predecessors. Instead of sending an army, he called for a crusade, a holy war against the Muslims who had taken Jerusalem. His speech was incredibly persuasive, appealing to the religious zeal of the European nobility, as well as their desire for land and wealth. According to the chronicler Fulcher of Chartres, Urban proclaimed, "I say to you today that the way to win everlasting glory is open. You can gain heavenly rewards without any risk, since the Lord has promised to help you with his own hand. Repel the hands of the Turks from the gates of Constantinople and take arms against those who wage war against the Christians." And the nobles responded by setting out on the First Crusade. The first major battle took place in 1097 at the Battle of Dorylaeum, where the European army defeated the Seljuk Turks decisively, capturing 100 elephants in the process. Though there were arguments over territory and leadership, the Crusaders managed to continue their advance into Anatolia. By June 1098, they had advanced as far east as Nicaea, but the city's formidable walls proved too much for them to handle. Luckily, though, the Crusaders had a secret weapon, gunpowder. Some historians believe that the Crusaders used catapults to hurl small amounts of gunpowder into the city, causing massive explosions and demoralizing the defenders. Whatever the case, the siege lasted only 6 weeks before the city fell. After sacking Nicaea, the Crusaders headed south toward Antioch, the capital of the Seleucid Empire. However, they soon found themselves under siege by an army of 20,000 Muslims led by the Atabeg of Aleppo. The Crusaders were able to hold off the Muslims for 7 months until reinforcements arrived in June 1099, but the Crusaders didn't stop there. Instead, they continued on to Jerusalem, which they captured and sacked in July 1099, though there were a few setbacks, including the siege of Nazareth in 1102 and the Battle of Hittin in 1118. The Crusaders had succeeded in capturing Jerusalem and establishing the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which would last for nearly 2 centuries. While the military results of the Crusades are impressive, they don't really tell the whole story. See, the Crusades weren't just about war. They were also about trade. As the Crusaders seized cities along the Mediterranean coast, they opened up new possibilities for trade between Europe and the Middle East. For example, when the Crusaders captured Antioch in 1098, they quickly realized that the city's harbor was much larger than anything they had seen in Europe. This led to an influx of goods from the Middle East into Europe, such as spices, silks, and sugar. And it wasn't just goods that were flowing westward. An increasing number of European merchants and pilgrims began traveling to the Holy Land to do business or visit holy sites. In fact, by the 1150s, it was estimated that around 20,000 Europeans traveled to Jerusalem every year. In addition, the Crusades sparked an explosion of intellectual exchange between Europe and the Middle East. For example, many European scholars studied Arabic texts on astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, and then translated them into Latin for a European audience. One of the most famous examples of this was the work of Gerard of Cremona, who translated over 70 Arabic texts into Latin. His translations helped to introduce European scholars to the works of Ptolemy, Al-Khwarizmi, and other Muslim scientists and mathematicians. This increased exposure to Muslim culture also led to a growing appreciation for Islamic art, architecture, and philosophy. For example, many European writers described the beauty of Muslim mosques and gardens, while others studied Islamic theology and law. In fact, some European nobles even converted to Islam. This cultural exchange did not go in only one direction, though. Europeans shared their own knowledge and innovations with the Muslims, such as the printing press and gunpowder. Despite these positive developments, it's important to remember that the Crusades were, at their core, a religious war. And as such, they were incredibly brutal. Entire cities could be wiped out in a single day, and non-combatants were often targeted. For example, during the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, the Crusaders massacred hundreds of Jewish and Muslim civilians. Similarly, during the siege of Antioch in 1097, the Crusaders slaughtered thousands of Armenians who had surrendered the city. So while the Crusades did bring about some positive developments, such as increased trade and cultural exchange, they were also incredibly violent and destructive. But perhaps the most surprising legacy of the Crusades is how they changed the papacy forever. See, before the Crusades, the papacy was largely seen as a spiritual institution focused primarily on saving souls. But the success of the Crusades showed just how much power the church really had. Not only could it inspire thousands of Europeans to go on a holy war, but it could also shape the course of history. In fact, after the First Crusade, the papacy's power only grew, leading to the emergence of what's known as papal monarchy, which held that the Pope was the supreme ruler of all Christians, both on earth and in heaven. This newfound power allowed the papacy to become one of the wealthiest institutions in Europe, as well as one of the most feared, and so ended the era of the warrior popes. It's easy to think of the Middle Ages as a time of poverty, disease, and war, but it wasn't always this way. From roughly 1000 to 1300, Europe entered a period of extraordinary growth, an interlude in medieval history that's come to be known as the High Middle Ages. We're gonna see how agricultural innovations led to a population boom, which in turn fueled the growth of towns and cities. We'll see how trade flourished and a new merchant class emerged, challenging the old feudal order. And we'll see how this era gave us some of the most enduring symbols of the medieval period, like the Gothic cathedral. So let's get started. All right, let's begin with the agricultural innovations that got things rolling. Beginning around the year 1000, European farmers began to experiment with new techniques that allowed them to grow more food on their land. One innovation was the introduction of new technologies like the heavy plow, which could turn over heavier soils, and the three-field system, which allowed farmers to make better use of their land by planting different crops in rotation. Also, there was the horse collar, which enabled horses to work more efficiently, which meant more productivity on the farm. And these innovations led to an increase in food production, especially, of course, in France and northern Italy. But if you're thinking, wait a minute, doesn't more food mean that people would just eat more and therefore not have any more babies? Well, you're correct, but other factors were at play here. For example, the climate in Europe during this period was unusually warm, which created ideal conditions for growing crops. And as a result, people stayed healthier and lived longer lives, which increased the likelihood that they would have children. Furthermore, the introduction of new foods into the European diet, such as the cuisines of the Middle East and the potato from the Americas, provided people with more calories and nutrients, again, leading to better health and longer life expectancy. Finally, there was also a decrease in warfare during this period, which may sound crazy given what we'll talk about later. But compared to previous centuries, there were fewer large-scale wars and conflicts, which meant that fewer people were dying violent deaths. All these factors combined to produce an explosion in population. In fact, between the years 1000 and 1300, the population of Europe nearly doubled, going from about 50 million to nearly 80 million people. Now, this population growth had a ripple effect throughout society. For example, as more people were born, there was more pressure on the land because everyone needed a place to live. So some people began to leave the countryside and move to towns and cities in search of better opportunities. And this migration to urban areas contributed to the growth of cities. In fact, between 1000 and 1300, the number of cities in Europe nearly doubled from around 400 to over 800. One important city in this period was Paris, located in northern France. Paris was the capital of the Kingdom of France and a major center of trade and commerce. The city was home to a variety of businesses and industries, including textile manufacturing, metalworking, and publishing. And as the population of Paris grew, so did its wealth and influence. Similarly, Venice was a major player in this period. Situated in northeastern Italy, Venice was a maritime republic, a form of government that emphasized trade and commerce rather than military conquest. And because of its location on the Mediterranean Sea, Venice became a hub for merchants and traders from all over Europe and the Middle East. In fact, at one point, Venice controlled almost all of the trade between these two regions. Another city that comes to mind is Cordoba in Al-Andalus, which was a major center of trade and finance. It was also a center of learning and culture, housing one of the largest libraries in the medieval world. Also, there was Cairo in Egypt, which was the capital of the Ayyubid dynasty and a major center of trade along the Mediterranean and the Nile River. Then, of course, we have Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, which was a major center of trade between Europe and Asia. And finally, let's mention Baghdad, which was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate and a major center of trade along the Silk Roads. Now, as cities grew, so did the number of people who worked in non-agricultural jobs. In other words, there was an increase in specialization, which led to the emergence of a new social class, the merchant class. And this new class challenged the traditional feudal order in several ways. First, the growth of towns and cities led to the development of new forms of labor organization, such as guilds, which were associations of merchants or artisans that controlled the production and sale of certain goods. Guilds set standards for quality and prices, and often had a monopoly on the production of certain goods in a particular city. Second, the merchant class began to accumulate wealth and power, which challenged the traditional hierarchy of the medieval period, which placed the nobility and clergy at the top of society. As merchants became wealthier, they began to build grand homes and dress in fine clothes, which symbolized their new status. Third, the rise of trade and commerce led to the growth of a new type of business organization, the partnership. And partnerships allowed merchants to pool their resources together and take on larger and more profitable ventures. However, the growth of the merchant class was not without its challenges. For example, they often faced opposition from the nobility who saw their rise in power as a threat to the existing social order. And this tension between the old feudal order and the new merchant class led to social unrest, including revolts and uprisings in many parts of Europe. But despite these challenges, the merchant class continued to grow in power and influence during the High Middle Ages, laying the foundation for the rise of capitalism in the late medieval and early modern periods. Finally, let's talk about the cultural achievements of this era, starting with architecture. During the High Middle Ages, European architecture reached new heights with the construction of soaring, majestic cathedrals that dominated the skyline. One of the most famous examples of this style is Notre Dame de Paris, which was begun in the 12th century and completed in the 14th century. Its flying buttresses and pointed arches are characteristic of the Gothic style, which developed during the High Middle Ages. Other notable cathedrals include the Basilica of St. Denis, which is considered to be the first Gothic cathedral, and Canterbury Cathedral in England. But it wasn't just cathedrals that were built during this period. In fact, many towns and cities were rebuilt and expanded, often with new public works projects such as bridges, aqueducts, and roads. For example, the English town of Canterbury was greatly expanded in the 12th century when it became the seat of a new archbishop. And this expansion included the construction of new buildings, including a new cathedral and a new bridge over the River Stour. Then we have the arts. Although there weren't any artistic geniuses during this time like a Michelangelo or a Shakespeare, the High Middle Ages saw the flourishing of various art forms. For example, illuminated manuscripts were highly prized possessions of the wealthy elite, and they depicted religious scenes or stories from classical literature. Some famous examples include the Book of Kells and the Book of Durrow. In addition, stained glass windows became a popular feature of churches and cathedrals, depicting scenes from the Bible or the lives of saints. Then there was sculpture, which was primarily used in the construction of cathedrals and other religious buildings. Some famous examples include the statue of St. Thomas Becket and the portals of the Basilica of St. Sernin in Toulouse. But perhaps the most important cultural achievement of the High Middle Ages was the founding of the first universities in places like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. These institutions of higher learning quickly became centers of intellectual activity where scholars from all over Europe gathered to study and debate. The curriculum in medieval universities was primarily focused on theology, law, and medicine, and students were expected to memorize vast amounts of information. The professors often relied on a method called summa, which involved presenting a proposition and then supporting it with a series of logical arguments. But while this method was effective in teaching these subjects, It didn't always encourage original thought or independent scholarship. Still, this period marks the beginning of modern academic tradition. Okay, so those were some of the defining characteristics of the High Middle Ages. But keep in mind that this was a long period, and there were regional differences and variations in the chronology. And there will also be plenty of exceptions to everything we've said here. In fact, there are a lot of things we didn't cover, like religion and the Crusades. The 14th century was a time of plague, famine, and political upheaval across Europe. In England, the unpopular King Edward III had seized control of Aquitaine, a territory on the French-Spanish border, while his cousin, King Philip VI of France, sought to regain it, but Philip's claim was weak. As a result, when Edward invaded France in 1326, he met little resistance. Soon he was the overlord of all of northern France, including Paris. By 1337, he even held Normandy. His ambitious eye was now on the French throne itself. And so began one of the longest and most destructive wars in European history, the 100 Years' War. In reality, the conflict lasted for 116 years, from 1337 to 1453. At first, the English won many victories. In 1346, they captured the northern city of Calais, becoming the only part of France to fall under direct English rule until the French Revolution nearly 800 years later. In 1356, the English completely routed the French at the Battle of Poitiers. Their King John II was taken prisoner, and the English gained further ground. However, during the next phase of the war, the tide turned. In 1369, the French managed to drive the English out of most of northern France and reconquer the city of Calais. For the rest of the 14th century, there was stalemate. The French occupied much of the north and west, while the English held on to Aquitaine, Guyenne, and some border territories, not to mention the city of Calais. Fighting continued sporadically until the early 15th century. By then, the French were ready for a final push. In 1429, a peasant girl named Jeanne d'Arc, or Joan of Arc, appeared claiming divine guidance and led the French army to victory at the siege of Orleans. That same year, Charles VII was crowned in Reims Cathedral, cementing Joan's status as a national hero. She became known as the Maid of Orleans and is still celebrated in France as a symbol of freedom and patriotism. Joan was eventually captured by the British and burned at the stake in 1431, but her impact on the war was monumental. She had breathed new life into a demoralized French army and inspired them to achieve victory. Following her death, the English lost ground steadily. In 1449, they were pushed back across the Somme River. In 1453, the last English attempt to recapture northern France ended in defeat at the Battle of Castellon. With that, the war was over. France had prevailed. But the impact of the 100 Years' War extended far beyond the military sphere. For one thing, the conflict radically changed the nature of warfare in Europe. Up until the 14th century, armies consisted of mounted knights who fought with sword and shield or lance. But as technology improved, new weapons became available, most notably the long bow. Originally developed in the 13th century, it could shoot an arrow up to 500 yards. With accuracy, it was extremely deadly. On the battlefield, it forced knights to abandon their heavy armor and seek cover behind shields or earthen ramparts. As a result, the armored cavalrymen became obsolete. It was the beginning of the end for the medieval knight. Meanwhile, tactics shifted away from large group charges and toward flanking maneuvers and rapid-fire volleys. Military organization also changed. The 100 Years' War saw the emergence of standing armies. Previously, kings called on local lords and nobles to raise troops in response to a threat, but now they assembled forces year-round. Soldiers were paid regular salaries rather than relying on plunder. Discipline and training improved dramatically, especially in England. King Henry V created a professional officer corps to replace nobility in command. In the end, these changes set the stage for the military innovations of the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. Another significant consequence of the war was the growth of national identity. The conflict was a source of unity for both the English and French people. Under the slogan, God, King, and Country, ordinary citizens were mobilized for the defense of the realm. They paid taxes and provided food, clothing, and other supplies for the war effort. Kings used the conflict to build popular support. They commissioned histories celebrating past heroes, such as William the Conqueror and the legendary King Arthur. As the war dragged on, however, the French began to resent English domination, particularly the extortionate payments demanded by their overlord. Ultimately, the conflict helped forge a lasting French national identity. Still, the consequences of the war weren't all positive. A major casualty was the English economy. The war drained royal coffers. Despite winning many battles, the English never succeeded in conquering France. The expenses of maintaining an army abroad left England deeply in debt. When King Henry VI came to power in 1422, he found himself owing more than 4 million francs, the modern equivalent of roughly $100 million. Parliament, which had become accustomed to heavy taxation, refused to pay it. Henry responded by raising new taxes on his own authority, sparking outrage among the nobility. Before long, England was in the midst of a civil war between the houses of York and Lancaster. But what about Joan of Arc? How did a peasant girl come to lead the French army? Born in the village of Domremy in 1163, she grew up hearing stories of the French king's misfortunes. As a teenager, she experienced visions of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and other saints telling her she was destined to liberate France. Believing God had chosen her for this task, Joan convinced the local bishop to outfit her in male clothing and allow her to join the French army. She was given command of a small force and tasked with relieving the siege of Orleans. Though initially skeptical, the French soldiers soon rallied to her cause. Defying the English, Joan led them to victory in several key battles, most notably the siege of Meung-sur-Loire. Then she helped secure the coronation of Charles VII, after which the English captured and imprisoned her. Now, we know you love Joan of Arc stories, so we've got something special for you. This episode was brought to you by our brand new series in partnership with a streaming service. Now you can dive deeper into incredible stories like Joan of Arc's and experience them like never before. Every week, we'll bring you an immersive adventure featuring the greatest legends and myths from around the world. You'll get exclusive access to an original series, all told through gorgeous animation and incredible storytelling. And if that's not enough, you'll also get access to thousands of hours of incredible documentaries and nonfiction series. Plus, the best news is that Wondrium is completely commercial-free. Now let's get back to our story. Following Joan's execution, the tide fully turned against the English. In 1435, the Treaty of Arras ended hostilities between France and England. The following year, the English king agreed to the Treaty of Troyes, which officially recognized Charles VII as the true king of France. Still, despite these setbacks, the English refused to give up. Henry VI launched a counterattack in 1449, but it failed. The Battle of Farmigny marked the last major battle of the war. It resulted in a decisive French victory. By 1453, the English were confined to a few small areas in the northeast. On July of that year, the English garrison in the city of Castellon fell to French forces, ending the 100 Years' War. In the aftermath, France and England negotiated the Treaty of Picquigny, which stipulated that the English king would relinquish all claims to the French throne in exchange for a noble title and some money. Afterwards, the two countries enjoyed a brief period of peace. But by 1492, tensions were rising once again. France and England would clash in another 100 Years' War. No, not really. We're just kidding. You'll have to tune in next time to find out about that. So, what do you think? Did Joan of Arc really see visions, or was she a cunning military strategist? Let us know your thoughts. And thank you for watching. When most people think of the Middle Ages, they imagine a time of knights in shining armor, brave maidens awaiting rescue, and fire-breathing dragons. But when we zoom in on a specific moment in history, say one day in the 14th century, that familiar fairy tale starts to fall apart. Welcome to my channel. And today, let's time travel back to a day in 1348. A year that might sound random, but it's actually the start of a story that's about to unfold all around us. It is June, and this is one day in the 14th century. With the sun shining down on the busy streets of London, citizens are going about their daily lives. They're shopping for fresh produce at the market, visiting friends and neighbors, and maybe even taking in a performance by the traveling troupe of actors. But unbeknownst to them, a shadow is creeping closer, a harbinger of death and despair that will soon cast a pall over everything. Our first stop today is a small village outside the city where travelers coming into London have stopped for the night. Many of them are merchants from Asia and Africa who have traveled long and hard routes with their goods. Some have come from as far away as India and China, bringing spices, silk, and gold with them. Some are Italian merchants who've braved the Mediterranean Sea, while others are fellow Englishmen who've taken overland routes through France or Germany. They've probably been on the road for weeks and are tired from their journey, but they need to rest now because there are rumors of an outbreak of the plague in the city and they want to avoid getting sick. So they settle in for the night, and soon many of them will be sleeping soundly in their beds, never to wake up again. And our next stop brings us back to London, where thousands of people are crowded together in close quarters. There are merchants and shopkeepers, farmers and laborers, young and old. But they're all crammed together in homes that don't have enough space or ventilation. And many of them are sharing beds because their families are too poor to afford separate dwellings. Soon, the disease that's been incubating within some of the travelers will start to spread. Victims will begin to feel the first symptoms of the plague, fever, weakness, aches, and pains, but many of them will try to push through it because they can't afford to miss work. After all, they're mostly poor and need their jobs to survive. But as the days go by, the symptoms will get worse and many of the infected will die. Those who survive will continue to spread the disease until every corner of London is affected. Let's visit a wealthy merchant's home and see how his day unfolds amid the chaos. This man has made his money trading wool and spices, and he's got a big order to fill soon, so he needs to get to work. He'll hire other people to help him pack the orders. And then he'll leave the warehouse district and head to his house, where his wife and children are waiting. His son is getting ready to take over the family business, but for now, he's helping his father count the day's earnings. Then it's off to bed, and hopefully a peaceful sleep awaits. But instead, the father wakes up feeling ill. Maybe he picked up the plague from one of the travelers in the village, or from one of his workers. Either way, he doesn't know how serious his condition is, and he tries to carry on with his day as usual. But as the day wears on, he feels worse and worse. He knows something is wrong, and he spends his final hours wondering if his family will be able to handle the business on their own. When he dies that night, they will be able to, because his wealth will allow them to hire others to do the work for them. In another part of town, a poor laborer wakes up not knowing that this is the last day he'll ever be alive. He's been working construction jobs since he was a boy, and he's strong and healthy, but the plague doesn't care about your age or your profession. As the day begins, he joins the other workers, and they head to the site where they're building a new cathedral. The work is hard and dangerous. They're hauling heavy stones and climbing tall scaffolding, but they don't complain. Then suddenly, the worker stumbles and falls off the scaffolding. The other workers watch in horror as he falls to the ground below, and they rush over to his side. At first, they think he'll be okay. After all, he's young and strong, but then they notice that he's bleeding from the nose and mouth, and his skin is turning black. They know that these are the signs of the plague, and they run away, terrified that they might catch the disease themselves. Our worker lies alone on the ground, and when he dies that night, no one is around to find his body. As the summer goes on, the heat intensifies, and so does the suffering. Bodies are piling up in the streets and homes, and the stench of death hangs heavy in the air. Authorities are trying to figure out how to stop the plague, but they're not sure what to do. People are afraid to touch the dead, and no one wants to come near the sick. Suddenly, there's an idea. Maybe if they throw the bodies into the river, the water will carry them away and prevent the disease from spreading further. But that just makes things worse because the Thames River becomes a floating graveyard. Fish start dying, and people become even more desperate for a solution. Eventually, they decide to burn the bodies, but that doesn't really help either. The smoke fills the air, and the sight of the burning corpses only adds to the misery. Then, like a bad dream, it's over. The worst of the plague has passed, and survivors emerge from their hiding holes, cautiously making their way back into the streets. They're greeted by a scene of total devastation. Homes and businesses are destroyed, and the entire city seems to be covered in a layer of dust. But slowly, life begins to return to normal. People start rebuilding their lives, and they're determined to make the world a better place than it was before. So how did we get here? What caused this terrible plague to strike and kill so many people? Well, the answer is a little complicated. The plague was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, and it was carried by fleas that lived on rats. The rats would become infected when they came into contact with wild rodents that were carrying the disease, and then they would pass it on to humans through their bites. Once the bacteria entered a person's body, it would quickly spread to their lymph nodes and cause them to swell up. This is where the term bubonic plague came from, because the swollen lymph nodes look like boils or buboes. From there, the disease would spread to the lungs and cause pneumonia, or it would enter the bloodstream and cause a fever and bleeding. If someone was infected with all three types of the plague, their chances of survival were slim to none. But why did the plague hit so hard in the 14th century? Well, historians believe that a combination of factors made it the perfect storm for a pandemic. First, there was a lot of poverty and overcrowding in Europe at the time, especially in cities like London. Second, the climate had been changing, and there were warmer temperatures and more rainfall, which created the perfect environment for rats to thrive. Third, there was a breakdown in the trade networks that had brought spices and other goods from Asia to Europe. And those trade networks had also brought rats carrying the plague. Finally, there was a lack of knowledge about how diseases spread. And people didn't understand that basic hygiene practices like washing your hands could help prevent the spread of infection. So how bad was the plague? Well, it was one of the deadliest epidemics in human history. It's estimated that between 75 and 200 million people died, which is about half of Europe's population. In England alone, it's estimated that 30 to 40% of the population died. And in some areas, entire villages were wiped out. And what happened after the plague? Well, it had a profound impact on European society. First, there was a labor shortage because so many people had died. This gave the surviving peasants and workers more bargaining power. They could demand higher wages and better working conditions, and they started to move away from the feudal system that had held them back for centuries. Second, the plague weakened the feudal system, which was already in decline. The feudal system had been based on the exchange of land for military service, but with so many people dead, there weren't enough nobles and knights to go around. Third, the plague led to a lot of social unrest. People were angry at the government for not doing more to protect them from the disease, and they started to question the power of the church. Fourth, the plague had a profound impact on art and literature. Writers and artists started to explore themes of death and decay, and they questioned the meaning of life in a world where so much suffering could occur. Fifth, the plague helped to pave the way for the Renaissance, which was a period of cultural and intellectual rebirth in Europe. The plague had killed so many people that there was a sense of urgency to make the most of life, and this led to a flowering of art, science, and culture. So there you have it. One day in the 14th century was probably one of the most important days in human history. Who knows how things might have turned out if the plague had struck a little earlier or later? But one thing is for sure, it left an indelible mark on the world, and its effects were felt for centuries to come. From castles to currencies, how did the mighty fall and the merchant rise? The year is 1348, and one of history's most devastating plagues is sweeping across Europe. It began in Asia, made its way along trade routes, likely through infected rats, and has now landed in the Italian port city of Sicily. From there, it will spread north. Death rates among the populace are staggering, with some areas losing half of their people to the plague. Those who live through the pestilence often carry visible marks of its devastation, pustules and sores, and sometimes even missing limbs. They say the dead outnumber the living so much that cemeteries can't hold them all, and mass graves have to be dug instead. We're pretty sure you've heard about the Black Death before. It wiped out half of Europe's population and is arguably one of the most infamous disasters in human history. But what if we told you it also helped usher in the modern era? You see, right before the plague hit, Europe was at a crossroads. Its old feudal system was rapidly falling apart, but the new world it would become wasn't quite ready yet. There were elements, of course, like an emerging merchant class and a growing network of trade routes that poked through medieval Europe like arteries filled with exotic goods and the beginnings of banking. But things were still stuck in the Middle Ages. For example, while long-distance trade existed, it was limited, expensive, and dangerous due to poor infrastructure and conflict. People still relied mostly on local agriculture for food. And despite a rising population in certain areas, life in general was still hard. The plague would change all of that. The thing is, the Black Death had little effect on Europe's upper class, which was largely made up of nobles and the clergy. That's because many of these folks lived in castles far from the cities where the plague was the deadliest. Now, that's not to say they weren't affected at all. In fact, King Edward III of England, who ruled over a substantial part of the country during the time, died shortly after the plague reached England. But more often than not, nobility was able to weather the storm, which left a power vacuum as feudalism began to crumble and before the New World took shape. The first thing to go in the wake of the plague was the feudal system itself, and that's because the virus wiped out such a huge portion of the population that it altered the balance of power between the classes. Since the Black Death killed off so many people, landowners suddenly found themselves short on labor. Remember, before machines took over, all work was done by hand. Fields needed to be planted and harvested, factories needed workers, and someone had to cook your dinner. Without enough people to get these jobs done, production slowed down and economies suffered. This meant landowners had to do something they never had before: raise wages and improve working conditions. It was the only way to attract people to work for them. But this abundance of available labor didn't just affect landowners. Land, remember, was the basis of power in the feudal system. If you owned land, you could collect rent, grow food, build structures on it, hunt on it, farm it, use it as collateral, and basically control an entire economy. So when the plague depopulated Europe, it also reduced the value of land. The result was a serious blow to the power of the aristocracy and a big opportunity for the emerging middle class. And it wasn't just the aristocracy who lost power during this time. Monarchies also saw their influence diminish as commoners gained bargaining power. In fact, in 1364, the English Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, which aimed to regulate wages and working conditions. Before then, monarchs had essentially been able to set whatever wage they wanted for their serfs and peasants and enforce it because they had no choice. But after the plague, that changed. Not only did serfs have more options for employment, but they also had rights that had to be respected. In France, the Jacquerie revolted against their oppressors, killing hundreds of nobles and burning their homes. These events forced French King John the Good to abolish serfdom in 1350. So now that the foundation of feudalism, land ownership, was being challenged, what came next? What else was there to own besides land? Enter the merchant. You see, while feudalism was built on land ownership, the capitalist system is built on money and property. And since the Black Death radically altered the European economy, there was a window of opportunity for new kinds of entrepreneurship. To take advantage of this new climate, however, there needed to be a flourishing of trade, and that's exactly what happened next. One of the biggest effects of the Black Death was a massive spike in global trade, and here's why. For centuries, Chinese silk, Indian spices, and Persian carpets had been the most sought-after luxury items in Europe. But the plague's devastation of the population meant that fewer people were producing these items, meaning prices went up. European merchants noticed this gap in the market and took advantage of it by creating new trade routes and organizations that allowed them to sell similar products for higher prices. The largest of these groups was the Hanseatic League, a coalition of Northern European merchants that grew to include over 800 towns and cities. Founded in 1260, the group initially served as a defense mechanism against Baltic pirates. But over time, the Hanseatic League evolved into a powerhouse of Northern European commerce, controlling most of the trade in the region, including grain, fish, timber, fruit, textiles, and livestock. Their shrewd business practices and ability to control supply chains allowed them to dictate prices and trade laws, which gave them unprecedented power in the political arena. At one point, the League even successfully petitioned the Holy Roman Emperor to pass laws favorable to their organization. They also established the world's first stock exchange in the German city of Aachen, and many historians consider it to be the precursor to modern capitalism. Cities became centers of trade and wealth. Places like Venice, Genoa, and Bruges became hubs for international trade and finance, while Lübeck, Hamburg, and Amsterdam emerged as centers for manufacturing. As the world of trade opened up, so did the opportunities for getting rich. And a handful of families rose to dominate the new financial world. One of the wealthiest of these groups was the Medici family of Florence, whose influence turned the city into a hub of art and culture. Over the years, various members of the family held important government positions, including the role of banker to the Pope. While these families grew immensely wealthy, though, they weren't alone. With trade flourishing, more and more merchants were amassing fortunes, which led to a whole new class of wealthy individuals known as the bourgeoisie. And with the death of feudalism, there was nobody to stop them from pursuing even greater wealth. All of this economic activity also contributed to another phenomenon, urbanization. As cities became centers of trade, more and more people began to move into them. And by 1400, some urban centers were home to nearly half of their nation's population. The growth of these cities presented new challenges like housing shortages, sanitation issues, and crime. But they also provided opportunities for upward mobility that didn't exist under feudalism. For the first time in history, people could go from impoverished peasant to wealthy merchant. And that brings us back to our original question, how did the mighty fall and the merchant rise? Well, thanks to the Black Death, both did. Feudalism and the aristocracy fell thanks to the sudden labor shortage brought on by the plague. At the same time, The seeds of capitalism were planted with the introduction of new trade routes and organizations, and with a surge in urbanization, the stage was set for the modern world. Is the coronavirus the Black Death Part 2? Or check out how the plague changed the world. Has the plague ever come back?